somewhat of a freight train presentation because I think we're covering about 3 hours of materials in about an hour and, 10 minutes. So we'll do some real quick introductions. We're going to try to leave time for questions. The other thing I want to remind you is that Lorna's going to have a question and answer period that's going to be about an hour. So covering conservatorships in 15 minutes, this is going to be fascinating here. Lorna is an attorney who does focuses primarily on planning for persons with disabilities here, and she's in the South Bay area. And she also is counsel for the Good Shepherd Fund, which is out there. Jim Huyck, gotten to know Jim pretty quickly here, former executive director of a regional center. Didn't he do a terrific job there? So I'm going to jump over Nina real quick. Jeff Darling here is with the regional center, which, by the way, I know we talked a lot about challenges of the regional center. They're not our enemies and that kind of thing. But he does a lot of work on development of services and that kind of thing. He's going to cover some material. Nina is a care manager here, and she's going to follow my presentation. And she's a private care manager. And for many of you, this may be the first time you've ever run into this kind of situation. But anyway, I use Nina a lot here, and I think you're going to see the value of all that. So I think at this point, Lorna, that's your show here. And we are going to have to hold questions until the end. You know, once again, Nina will be doing Lorna will be doing a full session for questions and answers, and also I'll be doing a half session.
How does this clicker work? This little arrow?
Right, left?
Right, left is up and down? Ta-da!
Okay.
Perfect, all right.
Even though you're ready to do it.
I'm going to take this out and hold it because I tend to walk. And as Steve said, I have a lot of material to cover in a very short period of time, but so I'm going to cover it briefly. I can cover this topic in about an hour and a half fully. I'm going to address or give information on what conservatorships are in general. We're talking about post-parental conservatorships. Who is going to serve in your place? I think you need to understand a little bit about what a conservatorship is before you determine who's going to serve in your place. I'm also going to discuss the types of conservatorships in the state of California because we have 3. So I want you to understand that as well as who will serve based on the type of conservatorship that you have in place. Okay, hopefully this makes sense as we go along. Okay, what is a conservatorship? Conservatorship is a court-supervised proceeding granting an individual legal responsibility for another. What does that mean? Well, prior to your child turning 18 or your loved one with disability turning 18, you're going to have legal responsibility for that child. Once that child turns 18, they are now legally an adult, no matter what their ability or disability. And you no longer have the ability to make all decisions for your child. So for example, you don't have the ability necessarily to make decisions regarding medical choices. Your child can now sign their own IEP. As Jim mentioned earlier, they can now be in their IPP meeting and agree to services with the regional center. So in order for you to continue as a parent to be in charge of those things, we need to have a conservatorship in place. Conservatorships are established for individuals typically in 3 types of situations. 1, for individuals who are unable to provide for their own personal needs, for physical health, food, clothing, and or shelter. Or it could be for someone who just cannot manage their own finances. And lastly, someone who's subject to undue influence. Okay, types of conservatorships in California. There are 3 types in California. This does vary state by state. So if you're not from California or if you move outside of the state of California, you're going to hear different terminology. There's a limited conservatorship, general conservatorship, which is also referred to as a probate conservatorship, and an LPS conservatorship. Let me just address the LPS conservatorship briefly. That's for individuals with a psychiatric disability. And I won't go into too much info on that, but that's temporary period, typically for a year at a time, and it needs to be renewed annually. Then limited conservatorships, that's for individuals with developmental disabilities only. Normally, the person must be a regional center consumer. Why is that? It's because the regional center needs to file a report with the court stating their opinion as to whether or not conservatorship is appropriate for the individual we're trying to conserve. The last one, the general or probate conservatorships, that applies to all other adults. So that's what most people think about when you hear the word conservatorship outside the special needs community. They're thinking about the general or the probate conservatorship. That conservatorship typically is for our aging parents. Maybe they have dementia or Alzheimer's, or maybe they're just subject to undue influence and they're going to give all their money away. So we'll conserve them to protect them. Okay, limited conservatorship. As I mentioned, this only applies when a child turns 18. Prior to age 18, you're going to have legal responsibility for your child anyway. And prior to age 18, it's called guardianship. So if someone doesn't have a parent that can serve to care for them, we go through a guardianship proceeding. So guardianships and conservatorships, very similar, both through the courts. Guardianship in California, under age 18. Over age 18, we're going to do conservatorship. The reason I wrote medical records up there is that's probably one of the prime reasons or primary reasons people go through conservatorship. It's the idea that when your loved one turns 18, often the doctors won't talk to you anymore. They won't let you have access to the confidential medical records of your child. They need to be able to give you consent. And often individuals with developmental disabilities don't have that capacity. Let's see, conservatorship of the estate versus person. For limited conservatorships, typically they're of the person only, because they separate those two. You can have conservatorship of the person, you can have conservatorship of the estate, and you can have conservatorship of both. For persons with developmental disabilities, generally we don't have conservatorship of the estate because they typically don't have assets in their name, so it's not necessary. Nor do we want conservatorship of the estate. You have to go to court, file accountings with the court, and you have to go back regularly. It gets expensive and time-consuming. So what we want to make sure is that you're not leaving assets to your loved one with the disability in their individual name. And as mentioned earlier today, if they have assets in excess of $2,000, other than an Inside Enable account, but if they have assets in excess of $2,000, they're going to be disqualified from government benefits. So typically, we're just looking at conservatorship of the person, and we're going to try and get all other assets in a special needs trust or an Enable account. Okay? Underlying objective, it's not to withdraw civil rights or limit civil rights of an individual with a disability. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to ensure that persons with developmental disabilities receive services resulting in more independent, productive, and normal lives. So I hear people thinking, conservatorship, oh no, I don't want to conserve my child, I want them to have freedom. We're here, we're going to help them become independent.
Can I ask something?
Absolutely.
That language in that statement?
That is from the probate code.
Okay.
Right, so let's see, conservatorship of the person. Okay, I said there's person and estate obviously regarding money, conservator of the person. The conservator, by the way, if I didn't mention it, conservator is typically the parents or the person that's petitioning to have legal responsibility for another. The conservatee is our loved one with a disability or the loved one that needs to be protected. So the conservator is responsible for the conservatee's care and protection, so care, custody, and control. Conservator must secure for the conservatee habilitation or treatment, training, education, medical and psychological services, social and vocational opportunities. Now, that doesn't mean that the conservator is going to be the provider of those services. That means that they are going to advocate for that child. They're going to advocate for this, and I say child, adult child, that loved one with a disability. They're going to advocate to ensure that this person receives all the services they need and deserve. In addition, the conservator, they're responsible for assisting the conservatee in the development of maximum self-reliance and independence. So not all our children will end up being totally independent, living alone, but we want to help them get to the greatest independence as possible. And that's what the conservator is charged with. Okay, powers. There are 7 powers we can ask for in a limited conservatorship. And by the way, one of the reasons it's called a limited conservatorship, it's limited to the powers we request from the court. What does that mean? We can customize this based on your child's needs. If you have a child that is very high functioning and pretty independent, and you don't want to withdraw all these rights from your loved one with a disability, you want to let them maintain certain rights, you can file for conservatorship and just ask for 1 or 2 powers. So what are those powers? One is to have access to confidential records and papers. Another is to determine where the conservatee resides. to make decisions regarding the education of the conservatee, to withhold consent regarding medical, so medical powers, the power to make medical decisions for your loved one. Contracts, the ability to limit the conservatee from entering into contracts. And then the two other powers that aren't granted as easily, depending on the county you live in. One is the ability to withhold consent to marriage, and the other one is to control social and sexual relationships. Those last two varies, this is a wonderful note, says they don't have to be done in 10 minutes. So they vary based on county, and it's going, they're thinking that those are pretty big civil liberties. We don't want to deny an individual the right to choose who they're going to socialize with. So those two areas, I said depends county by county. There are some counties that automatically grant all 7 powers. Counties like Santa Clara County, or anyone actually under the San Andreas Regional Center catchment area, they're not going to authorize those last 2 powers too readily. Typically, they're only going to authorize those 2 powers in situations with respect to a specific individual. And I'm going to give you a quick example, because examples are good, right? We can learn from examples. So I had a client who resides in the Bay Area, but their child resides in Southern California. They moved him to a residential placement in Southern California due to behavior issues, and it was the best program for their child. Their child ended up, their adult child ended up with medical issues and was in the hospital. It was going to be a long-term stay. So they decided they wanted to transfer their child from Southern California to Northern California, the Bay Area, so they could be closer and visit regularly with that loved one, with that child. Well, their child was an adult, unconserved, regional center consumer. The hospitals would not allow the parents to authorize the change in hospitals. We had to work with the regional center in Southern California and the San Andreas Regional Center to effectuate that change. So regional centers had to sign off on the change. And the regional center, so just to note, for an unconserved adult that's a regional center consumer, the regional center statutorily has the medical authority over that individual. So, might be a good idea to conserve your child, if only for the medical power, if you want to be there to make medical decisions for your children. And as I understand it from at least the San Andreas Regional Center, they generally try and defer to the parents when they can to make those medical decisions. But in situations like this, the hospitals would not allow the parents to make that decision. They had to work with the regional centers. So conservatorship can be very important. Okay, so now who can serve? And I'm not going into all the detail of the process. If you want to know more about that, as Steve said, I have an hour after this. So, extended family and friends. So, do you have another child that might want to serve and care for them? That's a good choice. Or other family members that are close to your loved one with a disability, we can add them. I just want to mention, though, that adding another conservator or having someone serve in your place when something happens to you, death or disability, it's not as easy with estate planning. For example, on trusts. If you're the trustee of your revocable living trust, hopefully you all have your estate planning in place, or you're the trustee of a special needs trust, in that document, you are going to state who is your successor trustee upon your death or incapacity. We don't have that luxury with conservatorship. You can't just notate somewhere on any type of document, this is the person to serve in my place when I'm no longer able to serve. We have to go through the whole court proceeding. So the court has to approve that conservator. So the conservatorship process is kind of twofold. One, the court's determining whether or not the conservatee should be conserved, but also they're looking into the backgrounds of the proposed conservators to make sure it's the appropriate conservator for that individual. So what do we do so we don't have to go through this process twice or 3 times? If you do have family members, extended family, that might want to serve, we might want to add them up front when you file for conservatorship. We can add them on from the beginning. They end up being a co-conservator with you. It is not a successor conservator. They have equal powers to the other individual's name, the parents. It's not a bad thing necessarily. Legally speaking, they all have equal powers. Practically speaking, we know typically co-conservators defer to the parents and let the parents make decisions. So it's not a bad idea to think about adding a family member or loved one up front. If they're over the age of 18, they need to be over the age of 18, you can add them up front from the beginning. Note, if there's 2 conservators serving, they have to have unanimous consent to make decisions. If there's more than 2, it's majority rule. So watch how many conservators you put on there. They might overrule you as parents. But it's also good to have them on, I think, because the idea is there's this transitional planning. You're teaching these other co-conservators your hopes and dreams for your child. What type of medical services have they been receiving? That you can invite them to the IEPs or the IPPs so that they know what type of regional center services you're advocating for. So they can become involved in the process early. So it's not bad to have them on up front. Okay, so let's say you don't have any family or friends that are appropriate to add. I hear people say, when we're gone, I understand the state's going to take over. The state's going to be caring for my children. I'm not quite sure what that means or what they're referring to, but I'm assuming they're thinking maybe the public guardian's office. So the public guardian's office will serve as conservator, but not on a limited conservatorship. Public guardian will serve on general conservatorships, and they'll serve on LPS conservatorships. They will not serve on a limited conservatorship. So why is that? Well, they feel we already have an agency that's funded by state and federal funds or government that's in place, and that's a regional center. We have the regional center there for your individual with developmental disabilities. And remember, as I said, your child must have a developmental disability for the limited conservatorship, and typically they need to be a regional center consumer. There are a few exceptions to that, which I won't go into here, but generally speaking, the regional center is already involved. So they want the regional center to step up. Now, if you were in Jim's session earlier today, you'll learn that at your IPP, your planning meeting for regional center services, there's 2 parties that come to that. One is the regional center, and the other is the consumer. But if the consumer is conserved, one is the regional center, the other is the conservator. So I would hope that you would want someone there advocating for your child in your absence and not just leave it to the regional center, because they'll determine what they think is most appropriate for your child. In some situations, that's great. They'll have a great IPP. But in other situations, maybe not so great. No one knows your child better than you or what services they might need. So I really think it's a great idea to have someone there representing your child in your absence. Now, Public Guardian's Office, like I said, is not going to do it. Oh, and here's the medical authority I mentioned earlier, and that's the statute where it's written that the regional center has the medical authority for unconserved adult consumers. Okay, who else can serve in your absence? Well, there are private and professional fiduciaries that potentially can serve. There's a website, which is PFAC, it's Professional Fiduciary Association of California, and there's a list of fiduciaries there. And you can search by county and city and by area. Professional fiduciaries can serve as trustees. They can also serve as conservators. So maybe that's an idea also. However, I will tell you, there aren't a lot of professional fiduciaries that I know that want to serve on a limited conservatorship. Why again? Well, probably many reasons. But one, they need to understand our population, individuals with developmental disabilities. But 2, I mentioned there's no conservatorship of the estate typically, right? So there's no money, so how are they going to get paid? So there are some out there that will serve, but if you selected them today and or you nominated someone today to serve later on, we don't know if that person's going to be gone when you're gone as well. So someone else would have to choose that conservator for you or the professional fiduciary for you. But they are licensed by the state if they're going to serve as conservator of more than one unrelated individual. There's educational requirements. So, and as I mentioned on the slide, there's specialty areas. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have too many good options yet. And there aren't a lot of good options if you don't have extended family or friends that can serve. But there is one other possibility, and that's a nonprofit organization. And there's 2 that I'm aware of, and that's it, that currently will serve as conservator. One is the Good Shepherd Fund, and one is the Jewish Family and Children's Services Organization. And let me go to my last slide that talks about it a little bit. So the Good Shepherd Fund, they have a table out there, and they spoke earlier. They had a breakout session. They're a nonprofit organization that serves primarily individuals with developmental disabilities. They'll serve as a trustee on a special needs trust, so it doesn't have to be a developmentally disabled individual, any type of special needs trust. But they'll also serve as conservator on a limited conservatorship. I mentioned on here that they're private pay, and it says $110 to $120 an hour. I will let you know that they've since restructured their fee schedule, and they are now only charging $80 an hour to serve as conservator. I've had the regional center serve in situations where the parents are still living, but it just wasn't a good fit as conservator. So there were, and in those situations, it was actually funded by the regional center. Not that I'm promoting that the regional center should fund all these limited conservatorships. That's not their favorite thing to do. But if there's a situation where there's neglect, abuse, or exploitation by family members or friends, they may step up and pay for someone like the Good Shepherd Fund or an organization like the Good Shepherd Fund to serve as conservator. Jewish Family and Children's Services. I know they primarily do probate conservatorships. They don't really do, or they don't do LPS conservatorships at all, and they don't do very many limited. I think it's unlimited circumstances, so that's not a very good option either. So I'm really sorry to say we don't have great options if you don't have family and friends. And if you want to talk or learn more about how to select someone in the family for serving, like I mentioned, I'm going to be speaking after this, so I'd be happy to discuss that further. One of the things I do tell people is think about where would your child reside if not with you, if they're living with you right now, upon your death or incapacity, where would that child reside? Who would they go live with? I had a situation where we named an aunt of the conservatee as the co-conservator in case something happened to mom. However, mom did pass away a year after the conservatorship was in place, and the aunt was not the person that would take on the proposed conservatee. It was the grandparents. The grandparents were his caretakers regularly when mom was out of town or mom was working and on weekends, and they wanted the conservatee to live with the grandparents. So we had to go back and file for conservatorship to add the grandparents on because that was the natural progression for that child, to live with grandparents and be taken care of by the grandparents. So when you are selecting someone, if you do have extended family or friends that can serve, think about where would your child reside if something should happen to you. And that's my time. Thank you.
I would say that is, and is it just all tab to switch over? Oh, somebody's doing it for me. Yeah, that was a lot to cover. Actually, that's something that deserves a lot of attention. So, once again, you might want to attend Lorna's question and answer period. Here, there we go. So what I'm going to cover here is along the line of this about who's going to be in charge of the trust after I pass away, and we might even look at it upon incapacity. Now, the difference between a conservatorship and a trustee of a special needs trust, as we'll go through, the trustee of the special needs trust might be able to authorize, for instance, doing dental care. I think it's fair to say that Dental is a pretty disgusting program here. So you might want to see, you might want to see a real dentist just for the heck of it. So the trustee could authorize seeing the dentist here. Does the trustee have the authority to authorize the treatment? And the answer is no. Here, I'm amazed at how many times doctors accept the authorization of a trustee, but they're a fiduciary. So that's where the conservatorship comes in. So let's talk a little bit about trustees. And once again, this is chapter 8 from my book. I'm sorry about plugging this. And there's a 4-step process we talk about, but the first part of this process is when you're talking about a special needs trust. I look at a lot of special needs trusts, and it's very common that there'll be what I call bare bones trusts, which are basically short forms that all they say is keep my kid on a welfare program, and it doesn't say anything else, okay? And as we kind of established, there's a whole lot more to special needs trust and future planning than just keeping somebody on their SSI, Medi-Cal, IHSS, and that kind of thing. Not that that isn't important, but really, you want to look at a special needs trust in a way as a private care plan here. So you got to be able to express to folks how you're going to do this. So, the thing is, as I went through this, providing supports for a person with a disability is not always intuitive. Like I had said in the first session, I can guarantee you that you have changed from who you were by having a person with a disability. It is, and sometimes you may not actually realize it. And a lot of the things that you're doing are not totally intuitive. And trying to explain to somebody and having somebody pick up where you left off with the IPPs and the IEPs and in the Department of Rehab and all that, that's not something that's for somebody who's unprepared. They're going to be able to pick that up pretty quickly. If you're a parent with a child of a disability, once again, as I said, take a moment and kind of reflect how you changed. And I think a lot of people, you get so involved in planning for your disabled loved one and getting them their services and that kind of thing. Sometimes I think you don't realize that we kind of forget that not everybody is on the same path and they don't have the same experiences. And I think, you know, many of us have run into situations where we end up with an unprepared person, either as a conservator or as a trustee, who's supposed to pick up where the parents left off. And that's not always an intuitive thing to do. It's a life-changing experience. So one of the primary duties of a trustee, when you're involved in trust litigation here or interpreting a trust, it always has to do with what was the intent of the grantor, the person who created the trust, okay? And so so what the courts will almost always focus on is what was that intent here, and they're going to do their best to try to fulfill that intent. What was it the person who set up the trust really wanted to do? A bare bones trust that just says, keep my kid on SSI and Medi-Cal isn't going to tell you much at all, and you got to document it. I'm going to skip this. And one of the things as we talk about this also, and you know, once again, maybe you're fortunate because I didn't get a chance to talk a lot about how I got involved in this, but I got involved in this because I witnessed a fair amount of abuse and neglect at Napa State Hospital. I wouldn't recommend going there here. And I wanted to get involved in being a civil rights lawyer, and I became a civil rights lawyer here because to try to stop the abuse that would happen in the hospital. Merely moving people out of state hospitals into the community does not mean they are not going to be subject to abuse, right? And the thing about it is that you must always be on top of that kind of thing. And the reality is that many of the folks that we serve are very vulnerable. You as parents, probably, I was a behavioralist, you probably can pick up cues when you know, and you know when there's something wrong. Even if your child is nonverbal, you're going to pick up those cues, but not everybody's in touch with that. So as we start talking with Nina here about private care management, a lot of times this is where we use private care managers, and we want to make sure that whoever is going to be the trustee or whoever's on the team, there's going to be somebody who is familiar with those behavioral cues or other evidence here to really detect abuse and neglect and stop it as quickly as possible. You know, I worked as in a number of group homes, and it may be that, you know, going back to Kathy, maybe Kathy has soiled herself like half a dozen times and, you know, at night and you're on the night shift. And Kathy may be giving you a very clear message, you know, and it may be, you know, I kind of go through this. Who has ever wanted to strangle a disabled person? I absolutely have. There's no question about it here. I'm not saying it's a good thing to do, but it's one of those things that we have to get in touch with. There may be a day when you're just not really in the mood to do this kind of thing. It could be the worker or that kind of thing. And the fact is, for many of these folks, abuse and neglect is a very common occurrence. And to tell yourself it doesn't happen, you know, you're just fooling yourself. So let me skip because we're short of time. So we want to clearly express what your intent is in your documents. So there could be a trustee in the future who's going to manage this trust who has no idea who you were. And part of this is you really want to speak to them about what it is I want this trust to do, okay? And a bare bones trust can only accomplish this to a limited degree. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. We all use different terms. The way I like drafting my trust is in the special needs trust itself. I like drafting clear information about what is our overall objective and not dig into the woods. So once again, oftentimes it may be that what I really want for my child is a focus on vocational training, or it could be that what I really want to focus on is for them being as independent as possible, or it could be that housing, appropriate housing, but whatever that global thing is, I like putting it into the document. With that, you can tie it to what I like to call it a journal of intent. Some people call it letters of intent or whatever. These are outside documents. They're not totally legally binding, but they oftentimes will be given a lot of deference. And there's a lot of good information, especially you as parents have, about your disabled loved one that will be really useful for the trustee. What medications worked? What medications didn't work? What therapist was good? what therapist wasn't good, you know, those kind of things. So the more you can document, the reason I like to call it a journal is what I like to do is have folks look at it as not just a one-time document, but something you're going to add to, oftentimes called a letter of intent. So here's what I'm going to end on here, and I'm going to do this in 7 minutes. It usually takes me 15. But I don't think any practitioner who does this work for any length of time is going to come to any other conclusion other than the choice of trustee or management system is the single greatest issue about whether one of these trusts is going to work or not, okay? When I first got started doing this many years ago, there wasn't a lot of guidance in this. So I got the special needs trust form, looks really cool. I would sit down with the families and go, who should be the trustee? Uncle Bob should be the trustee. Now, I didn't ask questions like, does Uncle Bob know anything about developmental disabilities? I'm just filling in the blanks, you know, and that's what we did in those days. And that just worked out fine until I started having clients die. And then I started discovering that maybe Uncle Bob, even though he's a great guy, wasn't a really good choice because he's really not equipped to take care of this. So I started learning about private trustees, private professional fiduciaries, that sort of thing, started adding to it then, and that helped a lot. But then as I got into it more and more, I really started discovering that what it really takes is a team. So let me show you how I look at this. If you look at a trust, and one of the things with a special needs trust is it's a form of what's called a spendthrift trust, which means that the reason it keeps your child qualified for beneficiaries is the trustee has absolute discretion and the beneficiary has none. The reason for that, for benefits purposes, is if your child had any discretion over those funds, they would become a resource. So once again, I am the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust. I have 150 beneficiaries. I have the power to refuse even the most reasonable request for a distribution, and I can say no, and no means no. Anybody got a problem with that? I mean, who would write a trust like that? You're taking, which Lorna and I do it every day, right? But, you know, you're basically taking the most vulnerable person in the family here, and you're giving all power to the trustee and virtually none to the beneficiary. And that's one of those things that I like to make sure I educate families about and see how we can mitigate that. So what would that ideal trustee look like? I'm going to do that and then run through one model so I can stay within my time. We would want to have the trustee who's going to act in the best interest of our disabled beneficiary and have some understanding of the system, a lot of the things we've learned today, in order to make that judgment. Somebody who's going to understand public benefits, keep up with changes to the law, and there are some cases, some situations where maybe keeping them qualified for benefits is more hassle than it's worth. Somebody who's going to wisely invest and conform to all statutory fiduciary requirements. I can tell you exactly when the market is going to plummet, and I can tell you exactly when it's going to go up, because I get a lot of families here who will always do the wrong thing with the investments here, and when the market is at the bottom, they're busy selling things so they can lock in their losses here. So once again, I have a foolproof, I have a foolproof way of timing the market. Is that a good way to go? Absolutely not. This is precious money, and this is why having somebody on the team who can manage the funds and do conservative, appropriate investments looking at the long term is so important. And if you have somebody who wants to day trade with your kids' money, that's a really bad idea, okay? Somebody who's going to understand taxes, which is something that, you know, when I was a civil rights attorney, I couldn't dream of saying this, but I love the taxation of these trusts. It's absolutely fascinating, at least to me here, but you want to get a good tax result when you're doing that. Somebody who's going to keep really good books. Social Security is reviewing these trusts more than ever before, and it's one of those things that we have to make sure that things are in order, and as long as everything is in order, there's nothing to be afraid of. Somebody who's going to provide that advocacy and prevent abuse, and that's what Nina's going to talk about after I'm done. Here's the one that some people, you may know somebody where they can do all these things. If they think they can do this, we got a problem. They got to outlive your child. And I have had folks trying to name their 6- and 7-year-old nieces and nephews to be the trustees because they want somebody that's going to outlive their child. And that, I'm here to tell you, that just doesn't make sense. So here's the thing real quick, so I can finish in about 2 minutes here. There is no such thing as the ideal trustee, and we have some trustees out there. And Herb, wave your hand. There's a real life. Any other fiduciaries in the room? There we go. Actually, the fact that the fiduciaries are here, I will tell you that they gave up a Saturday. I would give them extra points for this. Okay, so despite that, neither one of you are immortal, my expectation is. So, you know, the thing is, you've got to have the flexibility to deal with things. So here's the idea, and I'm going to jump to one last slide and then I'm done. The idea here is what I'm kind of going for is a checks and balance system. And the checks and balance system is that we're not going to have one person manage the trust. What we're going to do is have a sphere related to who's going to do the advocacy work and that kind of thing. Now, of the panel we have up here, that might be Jim and Nina, somebody who is going to be involved in making those decisions and giving guidance to the family to make these really difficult decisions you guys have to make every day. Somebody who's going to work on the accountability and keeping the books. That's what the fiduciary is going to do. Somebody who's going to work on the finances. That's something that John might be doing. And so what we're talking about is a team. So I'll just go to one slide real quick and there's a number of variations here. Of this, but just because we're short of time, I just want to get the concept down. Now, I am not suggesting that your family should not be involved in managing a special needs trust. On the other hand, what I have found in most cases is it's best to have good, experienced trustees. So in this model here that I'll describe, we might have a trustee. We'll go back to it. It could be one of our fiduciaries. It could be Good Shepherd Fund. It could be the Golden State Pool Trust. There's any number of ways of doing it. It could be corporate trustees. There are all sorts of different options. They're going to manage the funds, make the distributions, do the taxes, keep the records. You might have a care manager, which I'm just going to touch on here, but we actually use Nina quite a bit with Sage Eldercare, and you can explain why Eldercare. That's your thing here, your industry's thing. But they're private social workers, and they might work with the family about making sure that we're getting the services we need for our IPPs and that kind of thing, and also making sure things are safe and look for cues where maybe we're going to have abusive situations. With that, we might have an advisory committee of family and friends and whatever. And with that, their job is going to be to oversee the trust, to hire and fire the trustee. If the trustee's not doing a good job, you're out of here. We're replacing you with somebody else, somebody who can actually work and actually advise on these things, and to make sure, and also be able to amend the trust if laws change. That way we have a system that's going to adjust to whatever is going to happen, okay? With that, I'm going to ask Nina to talk for a bit, and then Jeff is going to talk a little bit about regional centers. You know, as Nina comes up, you know, on my quest to find the ideal management system, I used to work a lot with professional trustees, and there are a lot of professional trustees who do a tremendously good job. But what I learned is that most trustees are not social service professionals. I started about 10 years ago starting to use with care managers, and I will tell you that they bring that quality of life to the trust and have done some absolutely wonderful work for us. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you. So, Steve, I'm just, according to my calculations, it's about 5 minutes.
You've got 5 minutes more.
Okay. Oh, wait a second. Well, hi, good afternoon. I'm Nina Herndon from Sage Eldercare, and I used to have a client in his 90s who used to introduce me as his care manager from Sage Younger Care. So our name is perennially an issue, and so let's just suffice it to say we're Sage Life Care, and our youngest client is 14 years old, and our oldest is 102. I am a professionally trained gerontologist, which is why we sort of reside a lot in the arena of older adults adults, but many of those skills are transferable, and we have come over the years to work with many people who are disabled adults. Our team members are master's level social workers, nurses, psychologists, and gerontologists. And so that's a word about that, since Steve set me up to talk about that. But I think what really is germane is our role is to help families make smart decisions and provide care that is at a standard that is consistent with what you would want for your adult child, and to make sure that quality of life is always a priority. So this is sort of where we are today, talking about what happens. And sort of the signpost says, you know, is up ahead, saying that people are going to need help. And so how do you think about this? This is sort of turning your child over to somebody else, and what could that possibly look like? And that must be very scary. So one of the things that we think about is, why wait? Care managers can be resources that you can come to know well before you're gone, or well before you're incapacitated. Can partner with you and serve as a member of your advisory team, or can act as a buffer between some of the day-to-day stress and difficulties that can come along with, you know, navigating your adult child. And so part of what we do is think about, what do you do as a parent? You're advocates, you're educators, both of yourself and other people. And so you need somebody who knows how to advocate to be in that role. And that's what the idea is behind having a care manager. They're a trusted advisor who also knows a thing or two about caring for people. And so what do? We have all sort of range of functions. If you ever asked a care manager for a job description, it would go from, in my life, it's been working to advocate for somebody's care at the hospital, but it's also been repatriating somebody to France. And so we don't have a small definition of what a care manager can do. So if you think of it in terms of advocacy and caring and furthering the objectives that you have for your children, that's sort of where you can land. And there are some practical ideas like helping with housing and liaising with other members of the family. And this is particularly germane when you think about having like a family member serve as a power of attorney for healthcare in your stead, or a conservator in your stead, and you want to have a professional in the mix, because that person may be very loving and have the very best intentions for them, but may not know about the system, they may not know about mental health issues, they may not know about all the things that are out there. Thinking about helping them be as much, as much as they can possibly be. And so skills building, helping them navigate the system and keeping frustrations low, because when frustrations are high, bad things happen. Connecting them to resources and telling them about things that exist, creating opportunities and possibilities for them. And then finally, that brings me right to the issue of supporting quality of life goals. And so, as I said earlier, you could identify a care manager, for when you're gone, but you could also think about involving a care manager earlier on. And so the process of working with a care manager starts with an assessment. And so the idea behind an assessment is to come and meet with you and your adult child and find out about sort of life and what's going on. What are the issues that are important to you? What are the issues that are important to them? And sort of get us educated. And then let us tell you what our third-party part of view on the situation is as well, after having spoken to them and seeing a little bit about their life. And then serving as an advocate, or putting us on the shelf for a while and just knowing that you've briefed us and, and we're out there for you should the time come. These are the different things that we look at during the assessment process and try to get a good hold on. What is the person's legal financial status? What is their psychosocial status? What are their abilities and strengths? That's a big one. I don't need to tell you. Quality of life issues, their social connectedness, how connected are they with the things in life that give them a sense of purpose and meaning? How do we help them have easier access to those things that give them a sense of purpose and meaning? Making sure that our care plan matches the funds available. That's really important. And then, of course, the domain of health and health advocacy and mental health and all of those things are a huge piece of what we look at. By the way, part of what we come from in the arena of gerontologists, we work a lot with older adults who have dementia, and we do a lot of work educating people about behaviors, and they are expressions of a need. They are not things that people do because they are hoping to be difficult. And so we really transfer that philosophy to all of our work with older adults, especially those who are having, younger adults who are having any kind of behaviors. And so how do you find a care manager? You can certainly come up and talk to me afterwards. I have a national network of people who I've become familiar with over the years. And you are also able to go to this website from the Aging Life Care Association, which is our professional association. And the website is www.aginglifecare.org, and you can find a care manager on the Find a Care Management function. And that's it.
And I know for myself, here as Jeff gets up here, I don't know if this is working. If you go to that website, not every care manager has the skill set you're looking for, but it basically does list whether they work with benefits or the folks that they work with. So, Jeff?
Sure. So I don't have slides. Jill asked for us to send slides, and I sent her graphics of slides. I said, here are my slides. But I just kind of want to reiterate some of the things that have already been said. And let me preface that, pardon me, you've probably heard people say this all the time, but I'm not speaking for all regional centers, because of course there are 21 and we all have the same jobs, but we do them differently. So I'm nervous about speaking for San Andreas, and I really don't want to speak for all 21 regional centers. But let me explain what I do at the regional center too. I think that's kind of important. So I work in the community services section, also known at San Andreas resources. So the main job of a regional center is to coordinate services for your loved ones, and that requires services. So my responsibility is to make sure there's services in place that can be authorized. Not an easy role right now in the last 10 years. But in kind of getting an idea, because I don't really do the case management piece, I really felt I should connect with service coordinators, as we call them at San Andreas, and find out, what do we do in these situations? And I really have one simple message from the service coordinators and their managers and the directors, and that is not to wait. Really, at your next IPP, bring it up. We need to talk about what's going to happen with so-and-so when I'm gone, and really start that planning. That is, it's not easy for any of us to address our mortality, of course, but go there. I think we'll all sleep better. We certainly have, as Lorna described, this responsibility. That's why the public guardian doesn't get involved, that we're there to advocate, and if someone needed a conservatorship and there was nothing in place, we would have a role in that. We don't prefer to do that. You know your loved ones better than anyone, and we would prefer that you make these arrangements in a timely way so that we don't have to step in and do it. And that's the main message I want to give, so we can make up some time and perhaps have time for questions and answers. I do want to mention, Lorna mentioned the power to make medical decisions. So that's in the Lanterman Act, that the Regional Center Executive Director, his or her designee, can make medical decisions for an unconserved adult, right? And you need to know that that happens weekly at least at San Andreas. So we're on call. There's always somebody going to answer the phone. So a lot of times in the middle of the night, we'll get a call from Valley Medical, and they will say, here's the situation. We need someone to say, okay, give consent. And that happens a lot. So if that's a concern to you, there's another motivation to get things in place in a conservatorship or some other arrangement. Okay? So that's,
Jeff, on that note, just as we get into some questions and answers and that kind of thing, one of the things I think it's important to understand about a regional center is it's not a state agency here. It's a private nonprofit, and there are 21 different regional centers, and there are 21 different personalities. here, and they do change from time to time. But the thing about it is, and I think this is important for all of us to understand, here as we kind of end this session, is that it is shaped by the consumers and the families. And so what are the opportunities if folks aren't really completely pleased about what's going on with their regional centers? What are their opportunities to have some influence on how that works? Like, for instance, board meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. We would love to see more of you at board meetings. That's one of your prime ways to have influence on what's going on at the regional center. Obviously, there are advocates. There's the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. David and Sheridan are around today. Get involved. Come to the board meetings.
And then we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions. But then the other thing with it is that, once again, I'm on the board of the ARC of California, dealing directly with a lot of the challenges going on with the regional center. So you guys have like this safe full of money in the back and have unlimited resources, right? Here, no. Yeah, okay.
Cat's out of the bag, right?
But the thing is, I think it's important for us to understand some of the challenges that regional centers have. And it's important to understand that they're not the enemy. I mean, they're the gatekeepers. But what kind of caseload are we looking at here for a lot of the caseworkers? What do you guess?
62.
Yeah, 62. and
no, it's supposed to be 62, yeah. Right? Or and 66. It depends on the category your loved one fits in, but.
So here's the point:
but it's really more up in the 90s.
Into questions here. And well, just one other thing. Now, I don't know your regional center, but the turnover has been pretty high, hasn't it? I know for the regional center of the East Bay, it's been tremendous. And I know a lot of the parents I work with, they say I'm training one case worker after another. But
at San Andreas, it's been because of retirement, yeah, for the most part.
So there's two parts of this. One is we have to advocate for those services, but the other thing is if we're supplementing services, we have to advocate actually for the regional center system. And if we don't participate and if we don't understand what's going on, we're going to end up with waiting lists like every other state in the union. And once again, we are the only state with an entitlement. And I'm here to tell you, it's hanging by a thin thread.
It is.
I
think I'm safe in saying that San Andreas would appreciate collaboration and input.
So there we go.
Board meetings.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions, but I think one of the things I'd kind of like to discuss is and Nina, maybe you can add to this. So what's the difference between, a case manager at the regional center and a care manager? A lot of people say, well, isn't the regional center providing the same thing? I actually see a difference in the two. So what is the difference?
Are these on?
Yes.
Okay. So fundamentally, it's in the model. The difference between a private care manager and a case manager fundamentally is that we have 10 people. It is a full-time job for us. A master's level professional, 10 to 15 people is our caseload. So that affords us the ability to be very detailed, to advocate deeply, meaningfully, and to be able to practice social work in a way that is impactful. And I think that's why the people on our team would tell you that they choose to do it, is because they can provide focus, support. So I would say we all have the same goal, and we all, when Jeff and I sat down next to each other, we said, hello, we have friends, we have mutual clients and friends together. And we often sit down with the regional center team member and get things done. They can identify a problem, we can follow through on it because we have time. We have, unfortunately, the backside of that is that private care managers are funded, they're fee for service and not funded by any health insurance or anything else.
So I'll tell you what, at this point, since we're recording this, we have 10 minutes to take questions, so you guys know the drill? Here. Okay, good. And by the way, we're not totally ignoring this character. He's spent his time and we're short on time, so he'll be adding as we ask questions.
I have a question about if the difference between conservatorship and power of attorney, given that we do not have a conservatorship at this stage. If I were to get a power of attorney, could I talk to the HIPAA people with my son's insurance and that sort of thing? And my second question is, given that regional centers are loath to endorse conservatorships, but they have so little to do with my, for instance, with my son, and they don't know his idiosyncrasies, the fact that he might say, oh yeah, I'm an advocate, but he really is not an advocate, that sort of thing. How can they justify and how can we get around their attempts to perhaps object to conservatorship, limited conservatorships?
Sure, and I can address both those items, and if anyone else wants to chime in, that's fine. Regarding power of attorney being an option or an alternative to conservatorship, it isn't necessarily an alternative. They're very different, and for conservatorship, well, let's see. For power of attorney, you have to have capacity to enter into a contract, for example. So now, on a limited conservatorship, we are stating that that individual lacks capacity and can't enter into contracts, so we want to be able to limit that. So often they're mutually exclusive. If they qualify for conservatorship, they're not going to qualify for a power of attorney. There are individuals, however, that are in the gray area. They're higher functioning. They're still a regional center consumer, but maybe we can draft a power of attorney so that they understand it. So then a power of attorney could be an alternative. And yes, if they do have capacity, they could authorize the doctors to speak with you and release medical information. So that is a possibility. But often they're, like I said, almost mutually exclusive. The other thing is powers of attorney, just a note, are the person who is granting the power of attorney can revoke that at any time. Conservatorships are more protective, meaning the parents or the conservator's opinion or decisions are overriding that of the conservatee, even if the conservatee objects. On a power of attorney can be revoked at any time, and if they disagree with their agent, they can withdraw it, or their decision is going to supersede their whoever they appoint as their agent. As for the regional center, I just want to mention that I have not had problems with the regional center approving conservatorships. Very rare, and I file between 50 and 60 limited conservatorships a year right now, and I don't think, maybe one time I had the regional center question it. So, and that's the I file in 11 counties limited conservatorships, and so far I've not had any of the counties reject. There is one county that automatically objects every time, and that the court system there just takes the regional center's report as one of the many elements to determine if conservatorship is appropriate, and the court still grants the conservatorship, even though they filed a report that says we don't support it. But if anyone else has anything to say about the regional centers.
Is there an element of which of the 7 areas we're talking about in the conservatorship?
I would say financial and medical probably be the first two.
I can't think of a time we would object to that.
No, and I bet we could spend an hour on that alone. But as Lorna was saying, when you have a regional center that objects to every single conservatorship, the court goes, well, that's a nice philosophy, and then they ignore it. So that's,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
I have an interest in very long-term care. I have a daughter who's going to be 18 next week and very much disabled, and so I figure she will maybe live 70 more years or something. So we talk about having trustees. Okay, the ones that we know might not be around. Even a committee might not be around either. So you mentioned the committee could change trustees. Who changes the committee?
And what you have to do, if you think of it, all a trust is a contract to accomplish something, and you can get actually fairly creative. So that's a good question. And there's one of the things that I include in my trust, and the trust that I write is actually used by about 7,000 offices across the country, is we have, usually what we'll have is a family member or somebody who's absolutely going to be involved on the advisory committee, and we'll make them the chairperson.
Not for 70 more years.
No, anybody who thinks they're going to be here for 70 years. And they'll be the initial folks, and then what they'll have is other people that are listed, and then you have to have a system where you're going to keep adding folks as time goes on. I've seen a lot of special needs trusts with advisory committees where folks don't actually know they're on the advisory committee, they've never met, they've never functioned, and that kind of thing. So it's one of those things where you have to make sure that you can take it seriously.
I guess the question is, can the advisory committee itself add new members to the committee? Or
Yes.
does the trust have to be written in such a way as it specifies who gets on the committee? Because there'd be some way to replenish the people over time.
And here's the other thing, since unfortunately we do have to rush through this. I sit down with some families and go, well, who should be involved with your child's life? And I'll get long lists. I sit down with some families and I get a blank stare because it's very common for folks with disabilities to get so involved with their child they maybe don't have a second child, or it could be that the second child really isn't interested in doing this. It could be that they just really don't have a big circle of support. So, you know, for folks like Lorna and I that are drafting trusts, you've got to work with the resources you have. So it's fine to say it would be really nice to have a long list of people, but I'd say probably in about 1 out of 5 cases, I pretty much get a blank stare coming back, and you have to work with what you can. The only other thing I'll mention is, as far as trustees, I use a lot of corporate trustees. And for instance, I used A.G. Edwards for years and years because, of course, they'll always be around. Whoops, they're gone here. There's a number of folks who were leaders in trustee administration and no longer do it any longer. So one of the things, and I think is when you're looking for an attorney to work with, is they should not only know special needs trusts and all that, but they also should know who are the leaders in their industry. I've got a pretty good idea in my community who are the private fiduciaries that I'm comfortable with, who are the corporate trustees, who are the pool trusts, and that kind of thing. So when you're hiring an attorney, you're not just hiring them for a document, or you shouldn't. You're hiring them for their experience.
You know, I want to add to something to that as well. And when we put advisory committees in our trust, I usually put a range that the advisory committee, for example, will contain no less than 3, but no more than 7, or whatever the range is that my families want. And then we normally say that a majority of the currently serving advisory committee can appoint a new one.
That was my question.
So that's how we draft ours.
Exactly.
So.
Thank you.
We've got time for about 2 more questions, and I'm sorry for that. You, ma'am?
I have a quick question. I'd like to
Yes.
find out if the IPP holds the same legal power as an IEP.
Well, that would either be you, Jim, or Jeff.
I don't know what you mean by legal power, like.
Well, I haven't used my daughter's IPP very much, but her IEP has been a well-traveled highway. So I know that with an IEP, anything that's written in there is legally binding for the school district. So I'm wondering if I do manage to get some needs mentioned in the IPP, is the regional center legally obligated to provide?
Yeah, I think one aspect of it with a school district and an IEP, what they're committing to is an offer of services that they can deliver on. With an IPP, you're outlining goals and objectives and services that the person needs based upon assessed needs. But as I said, the regional center is dependent upon that vendor community. So if there's not the vendors out there who can deliver, I guess that's what your department does, is try to develop those, which is great. Not all regional centers are really have the operational budget to be able to have staff that does that. But so that there is that difference.
A little bit less.
A little less
yeah.
of a commitment, yeah.
Thank you.
It's very true.
Yes, sir.
It's very true that, you know, you
I
can
have a
have
couple of
a
questions.
lofty goal and not have a service.
You might, go ahead. You might pick the most important one. So your question.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One question is, you mentioned about California is the only state that's not on the mailing list. I didn't quite understand. I just want to know what exactly is the issue here and how it may go into a waiting list like other states, because I just want to know about that.
Here it is in a nutshell. There's a case called the ARC of California versus DDS. In that case, when they wrote the Letterman Act, they said that the regional center shall do this, shall do that, whatever. It didn't say may, could get around it. And by the way, this is like 25 years ago. We had a budget crisis. That's what we do in California. And so the DDS came back and said, well, we can't do this, so we're going to start limiting services. And the case said that an entitlement is an entitlement. But what it also said was that if we ever get to the point where we don't give, for instance, Jeff the resources that he needs to carry out those services, DDS is required to go back to the state of California and either demand more money here or in the entitlements, and then we would have waiting lists like every other state. Because of time, that's as far as we can go right now, and we'll be up here for questions. Okay. John, I think you're going to have the last question here, but we will be up here for a few minutes
Okay, and it's a quick question. Lorna, I like the idea that you talked about, for a sibling to be added as a conservator. You said up front, so I'm co-conservators with Jake's mother. Can I now add his sister as a conservator? It's not exactly up front, but it's after the fact.
Yes, the only problem is, or the only reason I say do it up front is because you just need to go through the entire process again, almost like you're starting from scratch. So, but yes, you definitely can add them later on. You can add one, as long as the person's over the age of 18.
How many people have done a limited conservatorship? How many people would like to do it twice? Right. Well, I want you to do it twice. It's exactly the same, except you don't have to prove them to be disabled. So what Lorna told you is very valuable. Thank you very much.